How's everybody tonight? We have been on a fabulous voyage back in time to the 1600s, and tonight we will round out that history. Welcome to the FEL Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas here at the Paul Cadario Conference Center. For those of you who don't know me, after these last few days, I am Sally Tagliamonte. I am the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in Language Variation and Change. Today is the third and final lecture focused on intellectual encounters between Europe and Asia in the 17th century. Tonight's focus is on the intriguing figure of Isaac de la Stalle de Saint-Martin, a French mercenary, and the relationship between France and the Netherlands. But before we begin, I would like to remind you that this morning at 5:01, we entered a new phase, the vernal equinox. The sun moved over the equator. So let us bring to that our minds and hearts into alignment by remembering where we are, the land where we live and work, and in particular, the grounds of the University of Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. With our feet well grounded, we have been learning about the history of another time and place. Let us intend that our new knowledge will enrich our ideas for the future. The FEL Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas originate in the support of many students of Professor Priestley. The lectures reflect Professor Priestley's broad interest in history and his dedication to teaching and scholarship. Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam is a good example of this. He is a distinguished professor and Irving and Jean Endowed Chair in Social Science at the University of California in Los Angeles. He is a specialist in the history of the 15th through the 18th centuries, focusing his lens on studies of India and the Indian Ocean in connection to the early modern European empires. Yesterday, we learned about the United Dutch East India Company. Today, we will get to know another character. Apparently, he's a shadowy guy. Hendrik Adriaan van Rede. Before we introduce Professor Subrahmanyam from a disciplinary perspective, I want to reiterate our housekeeping rules. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand to ask a question once the lecture concludes. Please speak into the microphone rather than speaking to the ceiling or to the next person, because the people at home, and there are quite a few tonight, would like to hear your question as well. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Use the chat function to submit your online questions. I now call upon Malavika Katuri to introduce our distinguished speaker from her disciplinary perspective. Malika.
So thank you, everyone. So I'm actually reintroducing Professor Subrahmanyam, having introduced him on Tuesday. And after Joe introduced him yesterday, I feel there's actually not much more I can say, which is actually new or original. But so I thought I would just draw our attention to certain continuities between the two lectures I have listened to so far. The previous two lectures were actually fascinating to listen to, as Sanjay Subrahmanyam has spoken with great skill, an erudition of worlds of connections, of networks, and to paraphrase him in his own sort of latest book, the polycentric histories in the 17th century, and to look at the points of dissonance, the points of tension, and points of convergence. Here we have been sort of examining these points of convergence and tensions in Europe and Asia through specific figures. And on the first day, what binds the two lectures together is the 17th century, the era of the growing expansion of the English, Portuguese, Dutch, and French East India companies. So on the first day, his lecture lingered on the cosmopolitan world of Italian traveler Pietro della Valle, who traveled from Italy to the Ottoman and Safavid Empire and India and beyond, illustrating his interests in geography, history, and philology. And the lecture also traced his network and the world of ideas, those who collected manuscripts and were interested in languages and ethnography, through an extraordinary multilingual archive. Yesterday, he spoke about the Dutch VOC, unraveling a complex visual economy of painters and painting, and painters with an ethnographic eye who had connections with India, Brazil, colonialism, commerce, patronage, and the world of print in Europe. These lectures have been remarkable examples of Professor Subrahmanyam's erudition, imagination, and making legible histories, modes of understanding, and geographies that, in fact, challenge easy analysis of both of colonialism and spaces that we understand as Asia and Europe. And in fact, they invite us to think beyond the limits of national cartographies and narrow historiographies at a time when the idea of the nation and the nation state is being invoked almost very uneasily in ways that are exclusionary and majoritarian. So it is, which is why the kinds of spatial geographies and the connections and networks that he invites us to think about in our own work, perhaps not in the same way, but the dissonances, tensions, and other things in our own research, which should be made legible, is, I think, what we should be thinking about and sort of listening to as we listen to his third lecture. So thank you, and with that, I invite Professor Subrahmanyam to come and give the third of the Priestley lectures.
Thank you, Malavika, and thank you, Sally. Thank you all for having been patient with me today. I'm going to not only deliver a lecture, but I hope I'm going to also acquit myself of a certain number of IOUs, because I have been promising responses to some questions on the 2 previous days, and now time has run out, and I have to actually cash those IOUs in one fashion or another. So. Let me start again with this map, which is a map which I showed you yesterday of the Netherlands as it emerged as a split entity in the course of the so-called Dutch revolt of the late 16th, early 17th century, when the northern part of the Netherlands, which had in large measure by in the course of the second half of the 16th century, converted to various forms of Protestantism, separated itself from the southern part of the Netherlands, from Flanders and Brabant, which remained integrated within the Habsburg Empire of Philip II and then Philip III. Now, we saw that in the course of the separation, the northern part of the Netherlands emerged as a sizable overseas power, starting with their strong trading and fishing connections with the Baltic, which is where the Dutch, of course, cut their teeth. They then proceeded into the Atlantic, and then in the course of the 17th century, they actually spread across the, so to speak, various oceans of the world, holding possessions in the different continents, for a time in North America, in the vicinity of the Hudson Valley, in eventually Brazil, which they had to give up in Pernambuco in the 1650s. In the 1660s, they then moved into Suriname, and they also, of course, held possessions in the Caribbean islands, which were not very major, but which were still not entirely negligible. So you had this presence. You had a presence in West Africa. Remember that the Dutch were some of the biggest slave traders of the 17th century. Their importance in the Atlantic slave trade at this period then places them in a position where they eventually overtake the Portuguese, who had been the leading slave traders of the period from 1550 onwards, when they built the sugar plantation industry in Brazil on the basis of that labor. The Dutch, of course, also then extended across a good part of the Indian Ocean and beyond into the China Seas, and as far as Japan, where they were the only Europeans after 1640 to be allowed a regular presence in an artificially created island called Dejima, which the Tokugawa shogunate had especially created so that they could have these red-haired barbarians at some proximity, but not an excessive proximity. So the Dutch who were living in the Dejima were in fact heavily constrained. They could not enter mainland Japan except on specific occasions. And in fact, everything about their life was more or less regulated by the Tokugawas. And this continued, of course, over more than 2 centuries until finally, of course, the Americans broke through this regime and created the conditions in part for the so-called Meiji Restoration of the second half of the 19th century. So the Dutch were all over from Japan through Taiwan, which they eventually lost, to an entrepreneurial Chinese warlord family, which took it over from them. They were very present in island Southeast Asia. They had some presence on the Malay Peninsula. They had many outposts across the shores of the Bay of Bengal. In southwestern India, a major presence in lowland Sri Lanka, the uplands remaining independent of them. And also in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, and even in many parts of East Africa. So this is a very, very widespread presence. And it's a presence which has attracted the attention of a large number of people who are not even particularly specialists of the Dutch East India Company. And in fact, some years ago, I was very intrigued to find an article by a very famous historian who happened to have been a colleague of mine, Carlo Ginzburg, the Italian historian. And I had never suspected that Carlo Ginzburg was actually interested in the Dutch East India Company, right? But I did find this article written by him, which is called Latitude, Slaves, and the Bible, an experiment in microhistory. And here in this article, what Ginzburg does is he starts from this text that you see on the left, right? So in fact, fortunately for him, the text was in French. And it is a text which is written by somebody who was actually a Swiss employee of the Dutch East India Company, and a man called Pury. And Pury wrote this text, which is called a memoir on the land of the Cafres, or the land of Nouts, Nouts being a Dutchman who had been present in southern Africa. This is a reference to southern Africa. And what it refers to is this person who worked for the Dutch East India Company, was present in in the Cape Colony, was present in also Southeast Asia, and eventually left the company's service and would end his life in South Carolina, where he actually founded a town called Puryburg, I believe. So this is an interesting story. The story actually has to do with the fact that Pury had an obsession with latitude. And he particularly employed this obsession with latitude to put forward a theory about vinoculture, about where you could grow and couldn't grow wine. And he was actually someone who therefore argued that if you could grow wine at a specific northern latitude, you could also grow the same wine at the same southern latitude. right? And so he was actually one of the people who very early on experimented with bringing the culture of wine cultivation and production, for example, into the Cape Colony, right? He also speculated on the possibility of doing this in Australia. So this is part of the thing, but Pury was also interested in the Dutch slave trade, and he also tried to make theological arguments on the legitimacy of the slave trade from a Christian point of view. So this is also something which concerns him in this sort of very all over the place kind of text where all kinds of different speculations are mixed up. There's a bit of biblical exegesis there. There's, as I said, a bit of reflections on latitude. There's a bit of reflections on wine culture. And there's a bit of reflections on, as I said, slaving and it's why it is actually perfectly legitimate for someone like him, a believing Protestant, to actually be a slave trader. Now, of course, the context for what Ginsberg was writing, which was very much focused on this text and this particular personality of the latter part of the 17th century, was given to us by the Dutch East India Company, where this man spent the bulk of his career. And you will remember that I mentioned to you that the Dutch East India Company was not purely a Dutch East India Company. It recruited people from elsewhere, and as it turns out, even from Switzerland. So we see this company founded in 1602, sets up its headquarters in Jakarta, renamed by them Batavia in 1619. There is this episode of the creation of a West Indies company, which does not last all that long, but is an interesting small episode. There is this brief flirtation with creating a settlement on the east coast of America, the fortification of Manhattan in the 1620s, the Brazilian colony, and then the Cape Colony that you see over here. And we also saw that this is the context within which there's quite a lot of artistic production. We saw the case of Andries Beekman, for example, who paints oils, but also makes watercolors. We also saw the case of the anonymous Cape artists, whom we're still to identify, who leaves us these extraordinary pen and ink drawings of the Khoisan or Khoi populations, what would perhaps at another time have been called Hottentots, the people, the pastoralist populations of the Cape area, right? Now, today I'm going to take the focus then to a particular trajectory and a particular set of networks which was operating within this company. So we are still thinking about the company, but we're going to approach it from a different angle. And my main interest is in this man that you see over here, whose name was Isaac de Lostal, and who, when he was employed by the company for reasons which will become clear, did not go by the name of de Lostal, but who called himself Isaac de Saint-Martin. And who lived then for roughly till the age of 67, eventually would die in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to come back to his trajectory. So who is Isaac de Lostal de Saint-Martin? So he was born in 1629 in the Pyrenees in a Huguenot family, right? So we know that there were these Protestant populations distributed across France in the 17th century. The wars of religion in the 16th century had not exterminated these Protestants or entirely expelled them from there. This would only happen in the 1680s, right? Because remember that in the late 16th century, when Henry of Navarre had become the king of France and founded the Bourbon dynasty, he had actually put in place an edict of tolerance, in which he said that he would not persecute the Protestants. Of course, he was himself a Protestant who had converted to Catholicism. But this edict remained in place through a good part of Isaac de Lostal's life. It would be revoked by Louis XIV in the 1680s, and that would lead to a great exodus of Protestants in the 1680s, for example, many of whom accompanied also William III, William of Orange, when he took over the English crown in the 1680s. So he is from this presence of Huguenots in the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees were known for the fact that they had this population. And after being brought up there and having received a part of his early education there, he decided that he wanted to have a higher education. Now, this was not easy if you were a Protestant, right, in France. So he decides, therefore, to leave for the Low Countries. And at the age of 24, he will move, and then he will begin his studies in Leiden, where, of course, there are various kinds of things on offer in terms of studies. There is, of course, theology, which is available, but there's also available the possibility of studying numerous languages, including Oriental languages, which is something which we discussed briefly yesterday. So he studies there for about 2 years. And in the course of his studies there, becomes very friendly with someone from a prominent Dutch family by the name of Hendrik Adriaan van Reyde. And this van Reyde is someone whom we will see quite a lot of as we move forward. He's a very familiar name to anyone who's actually looked at the history of tropical botany. So Van Reyde and Isaac de Lostal are recruited at roughly the same time into the Dutch East India Company, and they depart for Asia on the same ship. And he arrives then in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, and then he will spend the next few years in Ceylon and in Kerala or Malabar. He participates in this phase of conquests, which the Dutch are undertaking in this period to seize the Portuguese forts in these two areas from them. So he's, in fact, a military man who's participating in these expeditions. Okay. Subsequent to this, he will move to Batavia, where he becomes a lieutenant in the garrison, and he'll play a military role there. He returns to Kerala, to Cochin, in 1663, again to be with Van Reyde. As you can see, he continues then in the garrison in Colombo in the 1660s, back to Batavia in the 1670s, right? And then his career becomes a little bit more complicated. He starts getting engaged in various wars, which the Dutch East India Company is engaged in different parts of Southeast Asia. So in Banten, an important port in Western Java, in Sunda, in a succession war in the interior of Java, in the kingdom of Mataram. And all this while, he's then rising up the hierarchy, the military hierarchy of the Dutch company. He's then promoted to the post of Kapitan Major or Captain Major. He then starts getting some diplomatic assignments. He's sent as the envoy to Eastern Indonesia, to the Moluccas, to the island of Ternate, which is a separate sultanate. And then we'll see that there is a further expedition to Banten, where he will get involved in a controversy. Because of this controversy, he's disgraced. And I'll give you the details of this problem of the disgrace. He's sent back to the Netherlands. But he is, by this time, a formidable operator. He's extremely well connected. He goes back to the Netherlands, gathers his forces, lobbies some extremely prominent investors in the Dutch East India Company's stocks, in particular one family based in Utrecht, and he is completely then rehabilitated and allowed to come back with a promotion. So when he comes back in 1684, 2 years after the controversy, he's actually named a member of the Council of the Indies. So he's going to be actually a part of the Governor General's Council from this period on. Again, sent on other expeditions, diplomatic expeditions, for example, to Banten, and eventually dies in 1696 in a place where the old actually airport of Jakarta used to be located, which is called Kemayoran. And it's actually interesting because Kemayoran is named for him because he was the mayor. Right? He was so it's actually the place which bears his name, because this is a place outside of the fortified city of Jakarta, where he and other people had these estates, right? And these estates were actually places where, of course, they had their own establishments and so on, but there were also places, for example, where they could try to introduce new crops. They could try to experiment with the production of new products. And we know that in these areas, which were called in Dutch at the time, the Ommelanden, the lands around, this was actually the key place where, for example, for the first time, the cultivation of coffee, for example, is introduced into Java. And then from there, it will spread into other parts of Java, right? So this is what he does. He dies in 1696. And then 2 years later, his brother, who is still in the Pyrenees, and in fact is a fairly prominent person in the local parliament in the Pyrenees, who, because we are in the 1690s, has been now obliged to convert to Catholicism because no one is allowed to remain a Protestant in Louis XIV's France by this time. As a Catholic, then wants to travel to the Netherlands to recover what he can of his effects. And this is going to be an interesting part of the question, which is what does he actually leave behind? So we know actually that the one piece of material object which remains from is his trunk, is his leather trunk, which is actually today in a private collection in the Pyrenees, right? And we also have something which is rather tantalizing, which is this little piece of a permission document. I've not been able to see the rest of the document because it is in a private collection, but this is the only piece which was published in a local newspaper in the Pyrenees. If you actually look at this little fragment, it's a letter from Louis XIV, and it says something about how His Majesty has allowed Seigneur Lostal, which is the brother, that he would be able to go to Amsterdam, but it also refers to him as a nouveau converti. So he's just become a Catholic, so he's a new convert. And it says that, however, he's only allowed to go on the condition that he will be accompanied by a valet, ancien catholique. So they don't trust him, so he has to be accompanied by someone who is actually a proper Catholic, unlike him, right? So apparently he made this trip accompanied by this valet, and he recovered some things. And in fact, it's a bit of a mystery what he recovered, but he did recover the contents, presumably, of that leather trunk that we see. Okay. Now, Isaac de Lostal has left us various bits and pieces, a lot of which is spread in different archives, right? So this is actually something which is in a private archive. And fortunately for me, the person who possesses it decided to publish it in a rather obscure site. So I actually have these. This is a handful of letters that he wrote to his brother, right? And these are letters from the 1660s, from a period when he's still in Sri Lanka, when he's still in Colombo, right? So if you look at these letters, it says he acknowledges the receipt of a letter from Oloron. Oloron Sainte-Marie is the town in which they reside in the Pyrenees. And he talks about actually the fact that there are apparently some family business disputes. There are different members of the family who are claiming different things. So for example, he refers to the fact that something which he talks about the éclaircissement sur l'affaire de laine, which is presumably some kind of woolen textile which is being traded by members of the family and so on. And then he also talks about how there's an uncle, notre oncle de Lostal, and this person is also apparently posing some problem. And then towards the end of the letter, which is, as you can see, written in Colombo in January 1668, he says, je croyais me retirer cette année, mais je n'ai pu à cause du refus de mon congé. Right? So I was hoping to come back this year, but the company has refused to give me leave. So he's being obliged to remain, and he says that he's going to try to obtain it as quickly as possible, that he wants to come back, and that he actually does not want to stay on in Asia. He thinks he's done his few years, whatever he's done, and this is good enough for him. But as we know, this is not how it turned out. Actually, after 1668, he would remain for another 14 years, and in fact would only leave Asia because he was in disgrace and he was actually obliged to, more or less, expelled by the company, right? So clearly something happened to change his mind. And actually what happens very clearly is he gets more and more drawn into various kinds of activities in Asia, which make it more and more difficult for him to leave. Right, so this is Oloron Sainte-Marie for you, right, in the Pyrenees, and this is Gaul and Sri Lanka, to which he went. So it was something of a distance from the one place to the other, culturally and otherwise, as you can imagine, right? Now, we know that Isaac de Lostal was very active in many parts of island Southeast Asia, right? And these activities, as we've seen, covered at least 3 distinct areas. So he was involved in war. He was involved in making war. He was involved in leading the company's armies in various military engagements. That was one thing he did. He was involved in diplomacy. Okay. And apparently one of the reasons that he was involved in diplomacy was that he, over time, had acquired, apparently, a reasonable knowledge of at least spoken Malay. So he was actually in a position to be able to make presentations in front of monarchs and so on and so forth in various places to which he went. Okay. So this is a second aspect. And then there is another aspect which we will see presently, which is that he also progressively began to invest in all kinds of other things, in lands, in, as you've seen, in estates, but also in other kinds of quite interesting objects. So one part of this, this career is this repeated return to this particular city, the city of Banten. This was a city which was located to the west of Jakarta. Okay? And its specificity was that for a very long time, up until the 1680s, it successfully resisted the Dutch. So the Sultan of Banten was one of the few people in Java at this time, and especially almost all the ports in Java are located on the north coast. The south coast of Java is sheer cliffs, and it's more or less not accessible by maritime route. So the Dutch East India Company progressively took over and extinguished and bullied almost everybody in all of these ports. But the one set of people who actually managed to resist right up until the 1680s were the Sultans of Banten. And the Sultans of Banten were able to resist for a number of different reasons. One is that they actually managed to keep a hand in the pepper and spice trade. So they became a center for the pepper and spice trade, which was not in the hands of the Dutch. And because they were in the hands of they were in this trade, the English, the Danes, the French, all of them were interested in supporting them. Right? So they wanted to actually prop these people up in order that everything didn't fall into the hands of the Dutch. Now, the Dutch were extremely bad-tempered about this for a very long time. And finally, in the 1680s, they decided that they would move decisively to extinguish this, the independence of this port. And they proceeded to do so by sending a maritime expedition, okay, down to Banten. Now you can see that Banten is separated through the middle by this by the river of Banten. And so they sent in this fleet. This fleet is commanded by Isaac de Lostal. And it is his purpose, his orders are that he must displace the Sultan, replace him by someone in his family who is more pliable, and he must extract concessions out of him. And these concessions will include, for example, expelling the English, expelling the Danes, expelling the French, not allowing any other Europeans to trade in that port. So that's what he's supposed to do. Now, this will lead to something which I can't discuss today, but which is a very interesting moment when, after this happens, the English company will sue the Dutch company. And it's an international case in which the two companies actually have a dispute in which the English essentially say that the freedom of trade is something which is, in fact, which the Dutch jurists have been the ones who have legislated about, and therefore, on the basis of that very same doctrine of what is called mare liberum, the Dutch actually have no right to do what they've done to them. So this is going to be fought out over several years in a European court of some kind, where the two sides will present their arguments. And eventually, the Dutch will wash their hands of the whole matter and say, well, more or less, might is right. And we've kicked you out, and you suck it up. Right? So that's pretty much what the resolution is going to be. But it's a very interesting moment when the two sides actually confront one another with legal arguments concerning the freedom or the non-freedom of the seas, the place of monopolies or non-monopolies, and so on. Now, this is the thing in which Isaac de Lostal plays a role. And this is actually an engraving showing the alleged combat. It's a very fanciful engraving. As you can see, it says below, Oorlog in Bantam, war in Bantam in the year 1682, right? Now, if we actually look at the account of what actually happened in Bantam, it's a rather curious account. Because what we're told, effectively, okay, and this is the passage from a chronicle written some years later by Francois Valentin. He tells us that what actually happened was that Isaac de Lostal showed up, and then he sat in his ship and he didn't do anything, right? And instead, he kept sending secret emissaries and envoys to the court in Banten. And then the implication is actually that he was extremely familiar with these people. He had been here several times before. And in fact, it was suspected that the Banten people more or less had him in their pocket, right? Perhaps because he had been receiving money from them on a regular basis, or perhaps for some other reason. So eventually what happens, if you go partway down the first paragraph there is mention of somebody whom you will see called Kapitein Jonker. So Kapitein Jonker is a very interesting character. He was half Ambonese. So he was actually half Indonesian from eastern Indonesia. And he had been recruited into the Dutch company's forces. Now, Kapitein Jonker apparently eventually calls Saint-Martin's bluff and says, you've been given instructions, you're not carrying out the instructions. And so he then starts sending messages back to Batavia, and Batavia eventually says that Saint-Martin should be set aside, and that Jonker should lead the force, which he proceeds to do and proceeds to actually carry out the operation. Right? So the implication here is that Saint-Martin is actually someone who was more interested in pursuing his private money-making and so on than actually carrying out the orders of the company. Now, there's a second part of the story which is very interesting, which is that it apparently not long after this, when they had returned to Batavia, Saint-Martin was very angry, and so he organized the assassination of Jonker. He had Jonker killed, okay? Now, it's very curious because Jonker was apparently quite popular with his own indigenous troops, right? And so we actually have something which is what is called a pantun, which is a kind of an oral epic. And this is the Pantun Jonker, in which it's a Malay text, right, where what is being described is this Jonker, this heroic man, who in fact is the person who is righteous, etc., etc. But what in fact happened is that these treacherous other people get at him. They eventually wound up killing him. His wife, of course, is the person who's the other character in the story, who's trying to tell him not to go and get into this engagement and so on. But she's then the tragic figure. The two sons are captured, and then you can see also that they cut off his head, and then they bring the head to the walled city. Now you will see that in the third verse, what do? They kill him, and they bring his head to the kota, to the walled city, and the hadapan Tuan Mayor. So they actually are bringing it to Saint-Martin, right? They're offering Saint-Martin his head, according to this, right? So this actually becomes a little bit of obviously a kind of a popular vision in which Saint-Martin is not exactly emerging in the most glorious of colors, right? So we are getting this story where even the official chronicler tells us that he didn't really want to fight. He was trying to do something else. Jonker forced his hand. He comes back. He sneakily gets Jonker killed. And then we actually get even this kind of counter-popular version of the history in which, again, it's very clear Jonker is the positive character and Saint-Martin is the negative character, right? Now, of course, this is the reason why he's disgraced and he has to go back to the Netherlands, okay? But I just want to mention to you in passing that some 50 years later, in the 18th century, a quite well-known Dutch playwright called Van Haren wrote a kind of anti-colonial play called Agon, Sultan de Bantam. And this is a play in which Van Haren, who was a liberal and did not like the Dutch East India Company much, presents this play in which actually the Sultan of Banten is the victim and the Dutch East India Company is in the wrong. But in this play, okay, It's very curious to see that the character who winds up representing Dutch imperialism in its worst form is Saint-Martin. So this is the French translation, and you can see that in this, he says, this is Saint-Martin in front of the Sultan, right? And he's boasting about the Dutch Empire. Des rives où l'aurore éclaire cet empire jusqu'au bord de ces mers où le soleil expire. Coromandel, Ceylon, Malacca, Malabar, la victoire vous a tous liés à son char, and so on. So this is this kind of pompous speech, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what Saint-Martin was doing. He was actually sitting on his ship and not wanting to invade London. But in this literary reconstruction, he becomes the person who is leading the Dutch charge against this poor Sultan, who is the victim of the whole matter. There's also quite a side plot which involves the Sultan's daughter, which is also an interesting little episode, in which sort of adds to the tragedy of the whole situation. I believe the daughter commits suicide at the end, so something along those lines, right? So Saint-Martin then is expelled. He goes back home. But we know he comes back 4 years later. So this is the record of him coming back, which is an interesting little record because this is the ship's log showing all the people on board. And he's there. He's mentioned as Isaac Saint-Martin van Salis. So actually, it shows you exactly where he was from in the Pyrenees, which is Salis, which is a place where there are thermal baths and so on. So he's not actually from Oloron, but somewhere close by. And you can see what his salary is at this point in time in 1684. How did he manage this? Right? He managed this essentially because of the fact that he was extremely well connected by this time. So he was extremely well connected, in particular to Van Reyde, who had by this time become a fairly important figure in the company, to whom I'm going to return briefly. He was connected through Van Reyde to a family called Houdekoper, who were some of the biggest merchants in Utrecht. And so we know that from the Houdekoper family archives that he was lobbying them, and they were lobbying the company to efface these black marks in his record. And so at the end of 2 years, he succeeds. And he's going to come back, again, by the way, accompanied by Van Reyde, who has also returned to the Netherlands meanwhile. So they're both going to return. They're going to pass through the Cape of Good Hope, right? And actually, interestingly enough, there is a French Jesuit who's on board their ship called Guy Tachard. And he gives us an account of accompanying the two of them on this ship. So he refers to Baron van Reyde, who's being sent back with the title of Commissaire Général in order to visit all the places, as a kind of inspector general. But he also refers to the second in command, who has been now promoted somewhat imaginarily in his social status. So he now becomes le Baron de Saint-Martin, le Baron de Saint-Martin, no less. But he says he's Français de Nation, and he's Major General de Batavia, and he's, in this quality, he's the commandant of all the troops of the Dutch Republic in the Indies, right? So Tachard actually, it tells us about how, they visited, they spoke. He talks about how at a certain moment he was talking to Van Reyde, and then Monsieur de Saint-Martin entered. He's a Frenchman, and so on. And then he refers to the links between them. And he says, these two men have a very close link, fort grande union. He says this is because 30 years ago, when they were young and so on, they came together with their muskets on their shoulders, and they have become, linked to one another and have risen up, in the service of the company in this fashion as a kind of as a people who are sort of joined at the hip, so to speak, right? So he's giving you a sense of this close link. Now, references to Saint-Martin are strewn through the Dutch company's archives, right? You can find mentions of all the different things that he did, but usually it's extremely official, and it's written in very, language which reveals very little in reality, right? Except when there are these occasional moments when a scandal breaks out, like that scandal of 1682. So here, for example, is the 1692 account of the embassy to Banten for the coronation of a new sultan, where Saint-Martin was the Dutch company's ambassador to this event. And, it's perfectly anodyne. It has some interesting ethnographic details about the ceremony of the coronation as it was carried out at this time in Indonesia, but it doesn't really give very much away about him. Okay, so you can see this here, that he is going to the coronation of Paduka Shri Sultan Abul Mahassar Muhammad Zainul Abidin, who's the new sultan who's about to take over in Banten in 1690. So let's think a little bit now about what the network is that he's using. So we've seen the first element of it, right? I've referred to it on several occasions. Hendrik Adriaan van Reyde, very crucial person who has also been rising up the hierarchy along with him. But there are also some other crucial people. Johan Bax van Herentals, who became the head of the Cape Colony, and who also accompanied the other two on that first voyage out. So they are also very closely connected. But there are now more interesting characters, right? Georg Eberhard Rumpf, to which I will come back, a German who was a specialist in tropical botany, and also in general was interested in other flora and fauna, who was employed by the company in eastern Indonesia, and in particular in the area of Amboina or Ambon. Engelbert Kempfer, another German, who had worked in Iran as an employee of the Swedes at some point, and then would come back as a Dutch company employee and would wind up spending a very long time in Dejima in Japan, and is in fact the author of the first modern Western history of Japan, which was actually, for some peculiar reason, never published in the original language, but in an English translation patronized by Hans Sloane, the founder of the British Museum. Herbert de Jager, very important character to whom I will return, who was actually a peasant, who, however, managed to get help from the mayor of Amsterdam, Nicolaas Witsen, to do his studies in Leiden, and became, therefore, a specialist in Arabic and Persian in Leiden. But then, over time, he's going to acquire more languages. He's going to also acquire a passable knowledge of Telugu, and he's going to acquire a very decent knowledge of Malay. So this is another character. Daniel Havart, author of a very interesting book from the 1680s called The Rise and Decline of Coromandel, who was resident on the east coast of India for a good part of his life, and I'm going to return to. So these are the people who are in the company. And then those last two people are interesting. They never left the Netherlands, but they were connected to the company. Adriaan Reiland is professor of Eastern languages in Utrecht. And so he's actually the person to whom many things get to be sent. And in fact, he is very important because Reiland's collection in the Utrecht library is very crucial. Nicolaas Witsen, whom we've already come across before, the mayor, the burgemeester of Amsterdam, the man who knows everybody, is connected to everybody, and who, as I mentioned to you, when Peter the Great actually visited Amsterdam, he stayed in his house, right? So he's clearly someone who is very socially well connected, you might say, right? So these are the people. Here's just to very briefly mention, this is a recent, very interesting book called The Orient in Utrecht, which is a reflection on Reiland and his connections and so on. And that, on the other hand, is a somewhat hagiographical biography of Nicolaas Witsen called The Wise Merchant. So these are the people. But of course, I want to say a little bit, certainly, before proceeding on Van Reyde. Right? So who is Van Reyde? He's, of course, a Dutch company employee. He is someone who has some aristocratic pretensions. He is the Heer van Meidrecht. So he's the lord of an estate. But he's also someone who is very ambitious, and his ambitions essentially extend above all intellectually into tropical botany. So he's the person who's the compiler of this text that you see on the right, which is the Orthus indicus malabaricus, which is a kind of a very attempted a very complete account of the tropical plants which can be found on the west coast of India, and especially those which have a medical value, but not only those which have a medical value, right? So it's an illustrated text. And if you actually look at this text, you will notice something, which is that every plant has an identification with 4 names on the top right-hand side. So there is a Latin name written in the Latin alphabet. There is a Malayalam name written in the Malayalam alphabet. There is an Arabic name. And then there is a name in Konkani written in the Nagari alphabet, right? So these 4 distinct names are given. And and you can see that the plant is shown in its various stages. So from the seed to a fruit in cross section to the whole branch of a tree. Okay, and as you can imagine, this is a particularly luxury copy because the printed version would normally have been without colors. So somebody had to overcolor what had been printed. So this would only have been done in some cases of presentation copies and so on and so forth, right? So as I said, you can find this again and again, and it's always the same formula, right? So you actually have the Latin texts over there, and then it is followed not always in the same order. You have the Malayalam there. Then you have here the Konkani, which is a version of Marathi here, and then the Arabic. So it's always the same languages, but sometimes the order is shuffled. Now, how did he work? So, oh yes, just briefly, let me say he was a very influential person in the Dutch East India Company, to the point that he died at sea off the west coast of India, and the Dutch East India Company organized a massive funeral for him in Surat. This is a slightly fanciful version of his funeral procession, because I doubt very much that it was like this, because actually the Mughal government would not have allowed a funeral like this. But there was an important funeral. We know that, on the other hand, that he built this unbelievably pompous monument built for himself in Surat. You can still see it, right? This is one of the, maybe, the English then tried to compete by building another tomb for an Englishman. But this greatly exceeds it. And actually, this tomb was transported and assembled. It was not actually made by local artisans on the spot. So he's clearly someone who counts for a lot. But the question is, how did he actually put this together, right? So obviously, there is a kind of heroic version where you have this man who must have been a polymath and so on and so forth. Of course, over time, people have begun to peel away a little bit at these things. We realize that he could not have done this unless he had a large number of informants. Now, the informants who have been identified have been a few Brahmins from the Konkan coast, who would have been the people who would have written the Konkani versions for him. We know that there were a certain number of people from some of the kind of lower middle castes in Kerala who gave him information for that. But what has in fact not been realized that much so far is that he drew an enormous amount from an earlier work that existed. And this work is what you see over here, right? It's the work of a Italian priest. And this Italian priest, right, whose name was, as they say, nomen omen, so his name was Pietro Foglia. But so he winds up, he was someone who traveled through the Middle East, lived for a long time in the Arabic-speaking lands, then moved to Iraq, and then eventually moved to Western India. He would die in Surat, right? But sometime in the 1640s or so, 1650s, a good 40 years before Van Reyder, he had put together this text, right? And this text is called Viriadirum Orientalis, okay? And we have 2 manuscripts of it. This is the Paris manuscript, which is interesting in its own right, which has drawings and so on and so forth. Does not have those names. But in fact, we can see very often that he follows the exact order of the plants that this man has given. You can see, again, right? This is a areca plant that you can see. You can see a coconut palm on the left side, okay? So this is the Paris manuscript, as I said, but there's a much more elaborate manuscript in Florence where you can see much more detail, okay? But of course, the part of the problem is that this Italian priest was a very extreme mystic. And so sometimes he would start by drawing plants, and then you will see behind the plant the crucified figure of Jesus emerging, and so on and so forth. So there's clearly aspects of it which are perhaps excessively religious for someone like Van Reyde. But it's very clear that he owes him a lot. He has one mention of him in the preface, one measly mention of him in the preface, right? But it's very clear that he drew quite heavily on this, in addition to the input from the people in Kerala and the Konkani Brahmins, the Saraswat Brahmins, who actually helped us. So this is his right. So you can see various of his drawings from this. Now, the fact is that the network which these people are using is very clearly transnational. So they have no difficulty in taking on board an Italian priests, Catholic priests materials and incorporating them. You can see that there are many Germans in their network, to whom I'll come back quickly presently. And of course, there are also these French people who are there, right? Now, who are these Germans? Very quickly, they include Engelbert Kempfer, right? So Kempfer, who also was a medical doctor, who had been in Iran, who would spend time in Japan, who actually wrote works on, here this is focused, as you can see, on Rerum Persicarum, and eventually managed to wind up publishing quite a number of texts, usually in Latin, having to do with different aspects of again, flora and fauna and so on and so forth. And then there is, of course, Rumpf or Rumphius, extraordinary character, who actually spent the last part of his life, he was completely blind. And nevertheless, through the aid of his son, he was still putting out works. And if we actually look at the details of Rumphius, one of the things which we find, which is quite interesting, was that after he had become blind and he was no longer useful to the company, Isaac de Saint-Martin was paying him a pension. Right? So you can see that there is also this aspect of them taking care of different people in the network because, of course, they can put out these prestige works. So here, for example, is the Het Amboinske Kruidboek, which is a kind of account of the plants of Ambona. There's also another volume which has to do with the fish and shellfish of the area. They're all very heavily illustrated. Right, so this is an example of a page from his work. You can see that there is a certain degree of coherence between the ways in which these different works present their materials. Right? Now, it's possible, again, that in dispersed archives to find very interesting correspondence between these people in a mixture of Dutch and German. So, in fact, it's very important in this respect to step away from the archives of the company and find other places. So, for example, these papers are in the University Library of Gießen in Germany. I don't know how they wound up over there, but that's where they wound up. And in fact, we also have to bear in mind, to come to the point about philology, that these are also all people who are interested in language learning, in various processes with regard to language. So what you see on the left here is from the Reland archive in Utrecht, but these are papers which belong to Daniel Havard, the man who was on the coast of Eastern India. And what this is a notebook in which he's learning Persian. Right? So his Persian teacher is teaching him, and he's doing interlinear translations with the excellent hand, which is presumably that of the Persian teacher. On the other side, you see something which is not from the Dutch company's archives, but it's an interesting example of this, which is here is a kind of a glossary or a text where you have a left-hand side, which gives you a vocabulary, which is, by the way, in Italian. And then you have the three versions in Arabic, in Persian, and Ottoman. Right? So these are the kinds of materials which all these people had, which they were making use of, and so on. Now, of course, not everybody learned languages to the same extent or in the same manner. Right? And clearly, the person who actually went the furthest in this respect was Herbert de Jager. Right? So Herbert de Jager, who, by the way, again, you can see the network. So this is actually a published letter from him to Rumphius on the right. But in fact, he also publishes other kinds of reflections. Reflections, for example, the text on the left is much more reflection on language. And these were actually materials which were even getting printed at the time. And de Jager was starting to actually acquire some notoriety in Europe as a person who was a sort of a specialist in Oriental languages. Right? In fact, to the point that we now realize that Jager actually did something which is quite extraordinary, which is that he wrote in the 1680s a method for learning Malay, right? Which is the text that you see here on the left, right? Malay's de Leeskunst. Which actually, what you see on the right is the first well-known Western method for learning Malay by Vandley, which is from 1736. But this is a good 50 years before him. And here, what Jager is doing is he's laying out, right, on the basis of his prior knowledge of Persian and Arabic. Okay. Now, remember that Malay at this time is written in the Arabic script, right? But he's using his knowledge of it in order to actually provide other members of the Dutch East India Company an occasion to actually figure out how to learn this language. And we presume that must have included people like Isaac de Saint-Martin. Now, we know all this, of course, and I insist on the fact that we need to go beyond the company's archives. And we can actually find private archives which have got some of Saint-Martin's letters. Here you see exchange of his letters with the Governor General of the East India Company, which actually are quite interesting letters because it shows that he has a decent level of Dutch, by the way, which was not entirely obvious to me at the start because I thought perhaps that he would have tried to get away with French. But he obviously doesn't. He actually pushes the matter further, right? And he is living, therefore, part of the time in this estate outside of Batavia with his presumably small number of slaves at least, growing his crops in correspondence with Rumphius, in correspondence with Kempfer. We have letters exchanged between the two of them, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, when he dies in 1696, he leaves a big collection of books and manuscripts behind. Right? Now, unfortunately for us, we don't have most of these books and manuscripts anymore. But fortunately for us, they held an auction. And they therefore made an auction catalog. Okay? And a friend of de Jager's actually, therefore, made a list of the works in Malay. This is, of course, interesting in its own respect, because so far as we know, this is the first Western collection of Malay manuscripts. There's no earlier collection of Malay manuscripts. There's the odd manuscript which shows up in Oxford or something of this kind. But this is the first collection that we have. And it's an interesting collection. So this is what Saint-Martin has in his personal library, manuscripts on mysticism. He has, these kinds of narrative things like, Kalilava Dimna, which is the animal fables, the Panchatantra in a certain sense, right? It's the story of Iskandar Zulkarnain, Alexander the Great. Story of Amir Hamza, another celebrated Islamic hero. But we also have interesting things like a version of the Mahabharata, the Hikayat Pandava. Then we have things on Islamic law, fiqh, on astronomy, some history books, like the Hikayat Raja Aceh. We have the Qissa Sultan Banten, which you would expect him to have, a Chronicle of Banten, and so on. Right? So he has all of these things. Unfortunately, as I said, almost none of them have come down to us. We have been able to identify perhaps one of them, which is today in the Leiden University Library. But I'll just mention to you briefly the story of them. So this is the kind of thing this is what it would have looked like. Right, so this is one of the early Malay manuscripts in the Western collection, the Hikayat Siri Rama, which is also a Ramayana story, which is today in the Bodleian Library in England. So he would have been collecting materials like this. But to conclude, what is actually really interesting is that not only did he have this, not only did he have, by the way, collections of diplomatic letters. Now, this is very curious because these are letters acquired by Saint-Martin, sent by him to Reiland, after Reiland's death, auctioned by Utrecht University Library, and purchased by the Vatican. So it winds up today in the Vatican archives, right? But we know the origin of the letter is actually Isaac de Saint-Martin. Now, I want to conclude with, however, something which is much more also quite curious, which is the rest of his library, right? So this is not based on the books themselves, but it is based on the auction catalog. So his library consisted in Jakarta, in his residence, of 286 folio volumes, 428 quarto volumes, 323 octavo volumes, and 476 duodecimo volumes. I've just given you a selection here, obviously. But let's take a look at the kinds of things he was reading. He was, of course, reading, he had Van Reyder's Hortus Indicus Botanicus, nothing surprising there. But he has, for example, Paolo Giovio, the celebrated 16th century Italian historian. He has an early translation of the Quran into French, L'Alcoran de Mahomet. He has got the complete works in Italian of Niccolo Machiavelli. Right? He has got the Life of Oliver Cromwell. He's got Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. He has got Spinoza, Tractatus. He's got, as it happens, Pietro della Valle in Dutch. He's also got some really, he's got Robert Boyle's varied works. So he's someone who clearly, first of all, is still acquiring books, some of which are very much, 17th century works. So John Selden, for example, on law. Manasseh bin Israel, a very important 17th century Kabbalist and Jewish figure. He's got works by him. But he's also got, for example, somewhere in that list there, he's got the famous Pre-Adamite, which is this very controversial text from the 17th century, which made the claim that there was not one Adam, but many, which was considered to be an extremely problematic by somebody called Isaac de la Pereire. So yeah, de la Pereire, Pre-Adamite, you can see it, just above Les Œuvres de Monsieur Descartes. So you can see that this is a man who then has the tastes of someone who is on the edges of what we would think of as the early radical Enlightenment. He is what people would call in the 17th century in France a libertin. So he has all of these materials, including several materials on comparative religious history, on top of course, the other texts that we have seen. And he's keeping all of these in his residence in Jakarta. So this is one of the kinds of texts that he had, not his copy, of course, the Traité de la Jalousie, the means of keeping peace within a marriage, which is very strange because we know that he was not married, though he may have had some illegitimate children. Now, to conclude then, this is someone who is therefore a very curious figure, from a moral viewpoint, extremely murky, as we have seen. Not only murky to us, but murky indeed to his employers. Someone who, on the other hand, seems to have a very curious and interesting network, which goes into botany, which goes into natural history, clearly is interested in the comparative history of religions, interested in language, in patronizing philologists like de Jager and others, and at the same time, someone who is, as I said, making a career in the most Machiavellian manner within the ambit of the company, where no one is actually entirely sure of where his loyalties lie. So this is then the kind of figure that we have. And just to conclude, for a long time there was a myth, which is that all his library had been acquired by the celebrated Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, and that Raffles' ship, the Fame, had burnt on its way back to England, and that the whole library had been lost there. But subsequently, we have actually found the manifest of Raffles' ship, and it turns out that none of Isaac de Saint-Martin's library was on board. So whatever happened to it, it vanished somewhere. It may have vanished into dozens of libraries. And that is pretty much the trace that he leaves materially in terms of the books, though he leaves us traces all over the place in many, many archives. Thank you.
Fascinating third and final lecture, Professor Subrahmanyam. Thank you again. Now we'd like to invite Professor Kasturi and Professor Subrahmanyam to our main sitting nook one last time. Today our Q&A session will last for about 15 minutes.
So thank you. Is this working?
I think you might pull it off.
No, no. Can you hear me? So thank you, Professor Subrahmanyam. And so now throw the floor open for questions.
Over here.
Don't always want to be the first, but why not? Thank you very much. I think you did, in fact, deliver on some of the things that I was, I guess, hoping for from both of the yesterday's and the day before. But maybe I'll start with so that book catalog was fantastic. It just, wow. I was thinking yesterday when you discussed Rembrandt, I was thinking of Spinoza, contemporary, right? Because you said something yesterday about how Rembrandt's Mughal paintings were a kind of a way for him and for contemporaries to imagine the biblical past, right? So the reason I thought of Spinoza is, of course, the Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam, right? The diaspora post-expulsion. And so I was wondering about the kind of that context, right? You didn't have to go to the East or bring the East home because you have, quote unquote, the Oriental, the Jews of, right? The Jewish diaspora in the Netherlands. And I was kind of wondering whether and how that sort of fits into this whole discussion. And seeing Spinoza and all of the other texts of the Hebrew Bible and some of the other, right, that you highlighted in that book catalog, I guess in a way answered the question. I don't know. So my question is to pick up on what you said about this as an early Enlightenment figure. Now I'm seeing this as the Enlightenment as coming out of Orientalism in a way. Would that be a stretch? Or is that something we can think of? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that is precisely a point which I've been thinking about and trying to tease out. It goes back to a somewhat contentious discussion I had a good number of years ago, 10 years ago, with Jonathan Israel, about, at the time when he wrote his sort of 2 or 3 massive books on the Enlightenment. And I said to him that I was very surprised that he had written all these books on the Dutch East India Company. And then he proceeded to write these books in the Enlightenment. And he never thought that there was any link between the two of them, right? Now, I actually then subsequently tried to work my way through Spinoza's letters to see whether he ever said anything, for example, about the Dutch East India Company, right? Which would not have been totally improbable, right? And I think the only really interesting remark by Spinoza, which I found, was where he's writing to a young friend of his who is about to convert to Catholicism, right? And he writes to this man and he says, why are you convinced that you should convert to Catholicism? He says, have you looked into all the religions of the world which are out there, the religion of India, the religion of China, about which now we know so much? And have you actually made this investigation dispassionately in order to come to the conclusion that Catholicism is superior to all of these other religions before you made this decision to convert, right? So what you can see over here is that writing, I guess that is probably in the 1650s or thereabouts. He is aware of the fact that, say, the East India Company has created the conditions for all this kind of knowledge, right? And then it's a question of whether you choose to actually take it on board or not. And certainly you can find, a number of these figures. I mean, if you sort of flip it, a number of these figures that you see over here in his bibliography are people who, the 17th century figures especially. I mean, by the way, he also has 16th century Iberian figures who directly have to do with Asia. But I mean, Robert Boyle is very closely linked to the English East India Company, and had a lot of stuff going in, back and forth. Locke famously, had connections with, that isn't there a famous speculation on whether if elephants walk on a frozen river, whether the ice will support them or whether they will fall through. And this, of course, comes from his seeing images of elephants from Thailand. So yes, I think that this is actually a question which can be asked. Now, usually, very often, what people tend to do is to say, is to set aside these kinds of figures as minor. And in fact, undoubtedly, from many points of view, they are minor. I mean, for example, one of the interesting things about Isaac de Saint-Martin is he never wrote anything of any consequence, right? The people around him wrote and published and so on, but he never wrote anything of any consequence, right? So from that point of view, you would say, yeah, who is this person? He's a minor figure, right? He's certainly not Van Reyder. He's certainly not Rumphius or Kempfer. But it's interesting to actually, go down somewhat and look at what even someone who is certainly going to figure in no general history of the Enlightenment, still, what this person actually is involved in. Yeah.
I believe there's a virtual question. So perhaps we can actually have that read out and then we'll come back to the audience.
Yes, we have a question from the online audience. Which copy of the Hortus Malabaricus are you referring to, and are there annotations? And additionally, there's a question as to whether you could elaborate on the proof that Matthew died in Surat. Yes.
So to answer the second question first, there is a recent volume edited by the scholars actually from the University of Bologna, who include, incidentally, the scholar whom I referred to in relation to Pietro della Valle, Chiara Petrolini, but also other people, where there is quite a substantial chunk on Pietro Foglia in it, which includes an examination of his life and his biography and so on. And so, yeah, that's what I'm also drawing on. I have, in fact, they were kind enough to give me the Florence images, which I used. I've seen the original of the Paris manuscript, which is what I started with, but which is not as nice as the Florence manuscript, right? So now, with regard to which copy of the Hortus Malabaricus I'm referring to, so of course there are multiple copies, and in fact, as we know, I mean, there is a recent discussion in a volume on the sort of knowledge networks of the Dutch East India Company by the younger Indian scholar Anjana Singh. And in that, she actually discusses the existence also of Dutch translations of this of the Hortus Malabaricus, right? So you actually have quite a number of them. As I said, some of which are where it's painted over and colored, and others in which it is not. I would have to check where precisely I got these images from. But I would not be surprised if I got it from the one of the Leiden University copies. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So, yeah.
So my question was actually going back to this question of the minor figure and their reading habits. And I was reminded of Subu Aslanyan's reconstruction of the Armenian merchants' personal libraries and what that has to tell us about unlikely readers or people who we don't expect to have such eclectic reading tastes. And I guess one of the things that really struck me was the list of the Malay manuscripts and the very unusual combination of things that comprise that list. And well, I guess if I had to pass out the question first is how much of the library how much of that library collection tells us about the individual himself and who he was and how he related to the books and the reading habits of his time? And also, what does it have to tell us about the histories of circulation, of language and literary histories as well?
So, yes, I mean, you're referring to the Port Cities and Printers book of Aslanyan. Yeah, I mean, where, of course, part of his purpose is a different purpose from mine, which is to actually establish the importance of Armenian in print in this period, which he argues has been neglected. That it's much more significant as a corpus of works and so on. Now, so far as this is concerned, I'm inclined to make a distinction between the two, the Malay texts and the European language texts. And I'm inclined to think that the European language texts are much more a question of Samarkand's own interests. Whereas I suspect that the Malay manuscripts, right, are much more, you could think of them as a kind of a matter of the collective instincts and tastes of a group of people. So let's bear something in mind. There are actually very, very few Malay manuscripts left from this period, right? Anywhere. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 collections, including one collection in one of the smaller sultanates in Brunei, in Borneo, in Kalimantan. And then this is another one. It's a sort of royal collection, that one. So what we're getting over here is actually an interesting sense also of what was available, right? Because we have very little sense otherwise of, of what was actually in circulation and what was available for someone who was trying to acquire manuscripts in the 17th century, right? And it is clear that you can see 4 or 5 categories, right? So they're kind of like chronicles. There are these kinds of narratives, which could be referring to Indic stories, or which could refer to some kind of Islamic or neo-Islamic stories like Amir Hamza or Iskandar Zulkarnain and so on. That's another lot. And then there's some things which frankly, I have some difficulty in believing that someone like Samarkand would have been able to do a lot with. But de Jager certainly would have known what to do with, for example, texts on fiqh, for example, right, on Islamic jurisprudence, right? So there I'm inclined to believe that this represents more a kind of a collective taste rather than an individual. Whereas where the European books are concerned, I'm inclined to think that this, because it also seems to me that there are books in this collection which are published after he left for India, for the Indies, right? So it means that actually what he was doing was he was getting people to buy books for him and send them from Europe on the East India Company ships, presumably. So, I mean, that could only have happened if he was an active participant in the acquisition and the buying and selling of the stuff. So I think it is useful to think about this in those terms. What is frustrating, of course, is that it is still finally such a short list of Malay manuscripts. Yeah.
So we have time for 2 more questions. So
thank you, Sanjay. That was, again, absolutely scintillating, and also the way you brought the threads together. And so this is more of a comment. I think about the ideas that are kind of percolating in, his brain. I think you are on the right track, because when one thinks about the kind of religious issues that you laid out, uh, Protestants and the brother turning Catholic and so on. So, there was a book on the Council of Trent, then there were all the others. And so he's not living there anymore. He doesn't himself have to convert, but those are really, really interesting issues for him. So it's almost as if there is the more utilitarian life in a way, where he's using the Malay texts to learn about the milieu, which provides him his living. And then there's the world that, he's still part of, even if he's not there. But the books come back, you're saying, because the brother gets his effects? No. Yeah.
The difficulty is, so far, I have not been able to track what the brother got.
Okay.
Right? But it's true. I still have the intention of going and spending more time in the Pyrenees and trying to see if I can go actually beyond the official Archive Départemental to see if somebody will actually help me to work my way into the private collections.
Because I was wondering about textiles and spices, because that is the kind of effects that, may have come back, and that again would have been worthwhile, because there are those lists of spices which, people are kind of getting, and I don't mean the more common ones.
But
Yeah.
certainly bear something in mind, which is also sort of funny, right?
Yeah.
Which is that he actually dies extremely suddenly, without any warning, walking in the street, actually.
Yeah.
Right? So in fact, it's not as if this is someone who has
Planned it out.
planned, is disposed his effects, has actually thought about sending stuff back. Oh, and there is something else, by the way, which is appended to the end of that list of books. There is the mention, very tantalizing, of the fact that he had a handful of paintings, but with no further description. Doesn't tell us what kind of paintings they were, right? They didn't even tell us whether they were, oils or watercolors, or what form they took and so on. But we know that he had some paintings which were in that catalog, along with all the books that he had.
Yeah, but so the last comment is really about the the portrait you showed, because that, definitely depicts him as a warrior, right? He's wearing the, armor and so on. And that, again, I think comes back to that entire, the library and so on, but also the self-presentation and, the kind of rank he has. And I think that is where one of the interesting things that comes in, since I'm a modernist and I'm writing about Joseph Hooker at the moment, that what you have is a way in which that is perhaps also somewhere where that break happens. But going back to that earlier era, and I was really interested in what Arafat said, because we chatted yesterday a little bit about how scholars at Bologna and other places are going back to the collections which are being made, not just from Asia, but also from the Americas, and saying that in the Renaissance itself, there is all this that is coming in that has just been, as you said, separated from what's happening in Europe. And so in a way, your connected histories are kind of coming back there. But, I think it is that cross-fertilization of ideas, and some of them are kind of going places, and some of them are ending, because certainly on the botany front, Hooker's Himalayan journals is tremendously influential. When I went for my first field trip and I write about that, a local is giving it to me and saying, oh, you don't have to do any research, just read this. And this is an indigenous person there. But there is nothing local, nothing indigenous there. There's not a single Lepcha name you get of the plants, right? And that is, again, a big contrast. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have time for one last question.
Hello. Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful lecture for 3 days. I mean, it's a kind of an unfinished thought, but I'm trying to think about it as loud as possible. In the early modern encounters like this, we are meeting in a many individuals like these kind of actors who are intellectuals, also traders, also missionaries in some matter. They all have a kind of a passions towards individual passions towards the language studies and other kind of knowledge productions. But when it comes to historicizing these intellectuals or individuals, the categories are very much limited with the historians. Most of times we are end up using the categories like intermediaries or kind of a very defined categories, not categories to use to specify some kind of an early modern encounters. So what kind of a category you would prefer it? And also I have a much unfinished thought about the question of cosmopolitanism. Can we impose an idea of a cosmopolitanism to the, call them as a cosmopolitan elites of the early modern? I know that you have some reservations over it. Can you explain those things?
Yeah, I mean, to take the second question first. So remember, of course, that cosmopolitan is actually an actor category of the early modern period, and it is a very strange category because it appears in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, where it appears actually as a mocking description, as a person who imagines that he's at home everywhere in the world, right? Which some people have taken literally, but I have always sensed an undertone of sarcasm there. Someone who thinks that he's at home everywhere in the world, right? It's not whether the people whom he's dealing with think so, it's a question of what he thinks, right? So, but it is a category from that time. And then there's the question of who it fits and who it does not fit and so on. What further assumptions do we make? For example, a lot of the people who use the category imagine that it refers to people who are unbelievably tolerant, have all kinds of cultural tolerance, who have religious tolerance, et cetera, et cetera. And then, the fact is that when we confront them with the actual trajectories and histories of many of these individuals, it doesn't quite work out that way, right? So, so I think that is the reason why this and then there's of course the thing which is even more absurd, which is the people imagining that some cultures have a particular proclivity to cosmopolitanism and other cultures don't. So if you are Japanese in the 17th century, you couldn't be cosmopolitan. But if you're Dutch, you could be, right? So those kinds of assumptions are also very, very interesting in this respect. But I do agree with you. I once participated in a collective volume, on the title of which is a go-betweens, right? And that is another of these categories that you're referring to, right? And we have a whole bunch of articles, and I was asked at the conclusion, and this is what I actually tried to say in the conclusion, that at some level, it's a category which does too much and too little for us. Go-betweens. In fact, the moment you have a transaction, almost there is a go-between, right? So yeah, so it's a sort of a difficult problem, and especially if you go to the say occupational categories of this time or whatever it is, you can see someone like Saint-Martin is a soldier. He's an ambassador and therefore a diplomat, but he's also some kind of an entrepreneur, including in terms of agriculture and so on and so forth. And he's also obviously he's not really an aristocrat, though he's pretending to be one to some extent, right? So yes, it's actually difficult. And I actually even, in class terms, he's also a little slippery, right? Like Van Reyde is clearly an aristocrat, which is very interesting because there are very few aristocrats in the Netherlands. So he's some kind of a family of what you would call in French a notable. A provincial notable. That's the family. And that's what the brother who's left behind who comes to recover the effects is. But yeah, but that's shall we say the category from the period. But then what do we do with it? I also, by the way, the term notable is something which I like to use in other contexts, including South Asia. Because, you know, we often use the term, for instance, in Mughal history, a lot of people are called nobles. But actually, the term is misplaced in the Mughal context. These people are not nobles. If you're, you know, a high-placed Amir, you're not a noble, right? Because you're actually someone who's in that position because you are dependent on actually the state categorizing you as that. None of this is hereditary, and so on. Yeah. Now, your first question, if you just remind me briefly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it is the category question. Yeah. You know, but I think that we also need to bear in mind that, you know, these people do not necessarily form a single category. So we actually have to start with that possibility that all these people are not necessarily members of a single you know, category, either of our category or of their category, right? Because they are located socially sometimes in very different places, actually. And it just so happens that they are the people who are there at a certain moment of encounter or whatever it is. But that is I think too weak a concept on which to build a category. Yeah.
So yeah, so I think we run out of questions. So I just wanted to one thing that as you were having this conversation, I was just thinking of the empire of information and how, in a sense, this seems to be a very different way to even begin to think about this question. And if we had more time, I would have asked about the conversations and the networks that perhaps, you know, San Martin would have had with Malay, and what kinds of hints that we get from that. But that is maybe for sort of another conversation. But I just wanted to ask you in conclusion, I mean, what drew you to San Martin in particular? Because it's really interesting the choices you made of Pietro della Valle and then again here today. So I'd just be very interested in conclusion very quickly. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, actually, with Pietro della Valle, I mean, I've been thinking about him for a long time, and he's quite a well-known figure at one level, right? But the materials are sometimes not well-known. With Isaac Saint Martin, actually, it arose out of a conversation which I was having with some friends who are specialists of Southeast Asia, and I was asking them, you know, because we know quite a lot about, let's say, Arabic and Persian manuscript collections and collectors and so on and so forth. But I was asking them about Malay, you know, when did we actually start getting people who were putting these things together? And then actually somebody, very well-known specialist, French specialist of this, said to me, well, people say that it is Isaac de Saint Martin, but no one knows anything about it. So I said, okay, well, let's see what we can find out about him in that case. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So this seems to be the tip of a really exciting iceberg about the transnational histories of these sort of these really interesting members of the Dutch VOC. So with though there's, I think, food for a lot of thought and conversation, I request Sally to sort of end the evening.
Thank you, Malavika. So this concludes tonight's lecture. Thank you all for being here and the many questions you raised. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that there are more Endowed lectures coming up. If you like what you've heard, why not come back for the R.K. Tietzel lecture, which will be held on September 17th and be given by Professor Deanna Bowen from the Fine Arts Department at Concordia University. Following that, on October 7th, we will have the S.J. Stubbs lecture, which will be given by Professor Emily Wilson, who is from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a professor in the humanities and chair of the Department of Classical Studies. Check back on our website. You'll find updated details and further information. The UC Endowed lectures are really fantastic opportunities, as you've seen, to hear from world-class scholars about the things that they are most passionate about and that drive their curiosity. I encourage you to attend. Isn't it interesting what we learn when we come together in these ways? I'd like to extend thanks to Professor Malabika Kasturi, who has convened and moderated tonight, and Bonnie for manning the virtual situation, and Georgia for being our virtual facilitator. And of course, behind the scenes, there are many students, staff, and faculty who have been involved in Professor Subrahmanyam's visit. And most especially you, Sanjay. When I saw that title, Philology, Botany, and Religion, I thought, how's he going to put all that together? But as you've showed us, you are a master of making connections. So thank you so much for being with us. And that's it for today.